I was remembering, while I was preparing this talk, our mother educating her sons about the world that we had to navigate, and she taught us there are three types of drunks in this world. There's the happy drunk, and they're dangerous because you don't see that what they want to do is draw you into their game, and that's going to waste your money and it's going to waste your life. And she told us there's also the sad drunk, how they're dealing, and this is, boozers, how they're dealing with their lives. Basically, you've got to leave them alone. It's just depressing. It's hard, if not impossible, to help them. And then she told us about the violent drunk, where booze basically takes the brakes off self-control, and her advice was get the hell out of there as quickly as you can. And what she was trying to do was to teach us to recognise the signs of short-term and long-term danger, really, in using alcohol particularly. I mean, she was making the point that all these people are dealing with something. When we drink that heavily, we're dealing with something. We're dealing with strong emotions or strong needs or strong memories or greeds. And we're making booze our medicine. Now, Proverbs goes beyond saying that chemicals can be addictive, that the emotions that we're trying to numb or tame or forget or encourage even or inflame, they themselves are addictive and thereby potentially destructive. And of course, sin itself is described more broadly in the Bible as our primary addiction. It's the thing that we know is wrong, but it's hardest to put off, and we stare at it knowing it's wrong, but we're kind of powerless to leave it, incapacitated by it. So it makes sense if in Proverbs the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, then idolatry, coveting, unrestrained desire, deceptive desire is the opposite of being wise. Now, in 2016, we ran a teaching series here on mental illness, and one of our guest speakers was Associate Professor Alan Gisbers. He's head of addictive medicine at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. He spoke during the series about the models that are currently being used to understand and to treat addictive behaviour. Now, Alan pointed out that this was not just a matter of willpower. In fact, in addiction, there's often a willfulness, there's even a pride in choosing the destructive behaviour, in choosing the addictive substance. But at the same time, there's a helplessness that it's not accompanied by pride, but actually accompanied by self-loathing or even self-hatred, a sense of shame. So emotionally, we end up with this kind of positive willfulness and this negative shame, both feeding the cycle of addiction. And we find ourselves willingly choosing to punish ourselves. We're kind of trapped. That's why we need to think about life and death in the book of Proverbs, because what it does is it describes the path of life and the path of death. And I think what is truly demonic, and I'm choosing that word deliberately, about the worst versions of addiction is that it possesses us. It destroys our character, it destroys our moral ability and therefore our self-respect. It destroys our spirituality. We become degraded versions of what we once were or maybe could have been. It destroys our creativity. It all gets turned inward. It doesn't matter what the creativity is. If it's in relationships, the relationships have to serve this end, this addiction. If it's in work or business, those things have to serve this end, this addiction. But the thing I hate most is it just destroys really simple joys. You can't enjoy a sunset without the buzz of ethanol in your veins. You can't enjoy beauty without, lusting to somehow deface it or own it. And I think worse Worst of all, we see this and we judge ourselves, we condemn ourselves, we see ourselves taken over by this thing, and we watch the demolition of what made life worth life. And we're doing it at our own hands. Now in Proverbs, death is not just an event. It's not just the day of our deaths. It's also a place. So after death, Sheol, Abaddon, other places where the dead are there powerless, awaiting judgment. But death in Proverbs also casts a shadow back over the living. Death can be lived out, you see, by the living in the book of Proverbs, and in fact wider in the Bible, as I'll mention in a moment. So in Proverbs, when you set your foot on the path to death, what you're doing is engaging in any foolishness that saps or squanders your potential for life. So in Proverbs 5:23, we're taught that the fate of the wicked is he shall die. But the rest of the proverb explains what that looks like. He shall go astray. And life in Proverbs is to act, to think, to speak in a way that actually makes us flourish physically, economically, emotionally, relationally, morally, and all the rest of it. So in chapter 10, verse 6, we're taught the work of the righteous person leads to life, but the wealth of the wicked leads not to death, but to sin, the ultimate addiction. Wisdom is also a synonym for life. So in chapter 8, verse 35, wisdom cries out, "Whoever finds me finds life." So to have wisdom is like having access to the tree of life in Eden from Genesis 2. Or to put that another way, seeking wisdom is a way of entrusting ourselves to and receiving the grace to obey the Lord God. So that brings us to the passages about addiction that we've had read for us today. The sayings of the wise appear in chapter 23, and basically their context is a teaching for young men and women to know discipline in life and what can derail their lives right from the outset. And one of these disciplines is to be careful about the company you have as you travel through life. So avoid the company of drunks and gluttons, because the result will be impoverishment. You'll be dispossessed from your heritage, from your land, and your lives will be disabled and dysfunctional for producing either economic profit or gain for any relationships that are dependent upon you. So when Proverbs talks about addiction, about food or alcohol in this case, it doesn't talk in abstractions. It doesn't talk about, sobriety or the need for dieting or moralisms or give us, an 11th commandment or something like that. It just says, here's the hard truth. Here's what you're going to have to deal with. Here's what the wise have observed. If you overindulge in this stuff, your life's going to be hard. You're going to be poor. You will not meet your potential, and whatever gifts, abilities and resources you have as a young person, they're going to be wasted. And don't be foolish enough to think that time and chance and nature are going to wait for you, because they're not. They're going to be merciless. Life will move on without you. There will be no pity. There'll only be grief for those you should have taken responsibility for. And that's just the way it will be. That's just the way it is. Now, it's been said that the wrongs that we don't see or the wrongs that we don't name are often the wrongs that are harming us the most. In our time and place of plenty, where we have plenty of access to alcohol, we have plenty of access to food, and where we're dying from the diseases of obesity. When was the last time we heard anybody talk about gluttony as an addiction? Now, I'm kind of embarrassed to mention it because I know we all struggle in our approach to food, and we've just begun to talk about food wastage because we realise it's making our world less and less habitable. But we're wasting resources, but we're also wasting food by being addicted to its pleasure and over-consuming. And of course, in this time of COVID-19 enforced isolation, we're not only eating more, but alcohol sales are peaking as well. And there's concern enough, isn't there, in the community about domestic violence, and there's concern about how we're going to exercise enough self-control in these strange, stressful and confined circumstances. And we're consuming more booze to take the edge off our emotions. But it's a risky strategy because it works at the cost of taking away also our inhibitions, the inhibitions that we actually need for the sake of looking after others. Now, the reading from Proverbs 31 is wonderful, but my goodness, it's just as confronting. The woman speaking is the mother of a non-Israelite king. And she has committed her son to the God of the Hebrews in verse 2. And she says this is how a king, this is how a good leader, a good administrator should act. And it's actually here to teach all of us because regardless of our background and regardless of our level of responsibilities, we're all leaders in some part of our lives. We all have responsibilities for other people. And we either pick that up well or we deny it, and others suffer as a result. So there were two addictions that the mother warns her son Lemuel about. First is sexual addiction, and the second is the alcoholism of the party life. Now, sexual addiction, it can dominate a life, it can rob it of wisdom and wealth just as methamphetamines. It's not only the politics involved in multiple relationships, or the squandered time or energy or money, and the lies, the lying over and over and over again. It's the relational carnage. It's the destruction of peace and contentment. And most of all, it is that sexual addictions take us away from what matters, what's profitable, the responsibilities that actually build up and promote life. And then there's booze. Well, it's not the king's job, prerogative, to live the party life. There are plenty of examples of tragic consequences of this in the scriptures, of Belshazzar of Babylon, or Xerxes of Persia, or Herod of Antioch, with John the Baptist just making foolish decisions under the influence of alcohol, as I like to say. What the king's job is, says Lemuel's mother, is to uphold the right of the poor. Isn't that interesting? You've got to uphold the right of the people in the culture who can least defend themselves, because they can least defend themselves. There's another Hebrew proverb that says, the rich does wrong and boasts about it. The poor has wrong done to him and has to apologise. So unless there is a sober king around, a sober administration, telling it as it is and as it should be, they will suffer. And that is your responsibility, Lemuel, says his mum. You need to be that goodness for the sake of others, or they will suffer. There is one place where she allows for drunkenness, and basically that's in palliative care, there in verse 6. For those in deep distress, those who are close to the end, let them have alcohol as a medicine of relief, that they may forget their poverty and their misery just for a time. And I think every church-run palliative care unit in the world will say amen to that. And thank God for the availability of opioids that we have, as well as maybe occasionally the availability of strong alcohol. Well, that brings us to grace and love. When Alan Gisbers was here talking about contemporary treatments of addiction, he finished by talking about the power of grace and the power of love. He told the story of Jesus from John chapter 4 of the woman at the well. Had many husbands and lovers, but there was sheer power in Jesus, just like Proverbs, telling her what her life was actually like. Just not condemning her, not doing anything, just saying, this is reality for you, this is what you've done. And she ran to the village saying, here is someone who's told me everything I ever did. It's like she was saying, I am known, I am seen. And there's relief for her in that, because even knowing what she'd done, Jesus still spoke to her. Jesus still asked her for help, knowing who she is. It's a really moving story in the context of John, because as we read the parts of John's Gospel that come just before this, we realise that Jesus did not entrust himself to many people. In fact, Jesus has told no one up to this point who he actually is, except he tells this Samaritan woman who he is. Out in the midday sun while they've come to collect water, and he's thirsty and asks for a drink from the well. Jesus doesn't entrust himself to many people, but he entrusts himself to her. And he still does that. He entrusts himself to the strugglers, to the mentally broken, looking for grace, for the sexually damaged, for the recovering alcoholic, the repentant brute, the unloved who learned how to love, the greedy who learned how to give by the grace of God. All these people, he says, enter the kingdom of heaven before the scribe and the Pharisee. And come to me, he says, all who are burdened and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So come to me with your addictions, with your brokenness, with that self-loathing, with that angry pride, and you will find rest for your souls. Now, Alan said that still the most effective long-term treatment for addiction is what happens at every AA meeting, where you call upon a higher power. You call upon something outside yourself for what? For help, for grace, for forgiveness. The presence and the help of God. And if you've been hanging around churches for a while, you'll know that the church is littered with stories of people who, under the power of God's Spirit, have been lifted from the possession of addiction in all its forms. Well, that's grace. But there's also love. There's a strange thing about us human beings, and research shows this, that we're often more motivated to care for others than for ourselves. And Proverbs knows this, And I think that is why Proverbs documents the cost of addiction not only to the addict, but also to the people they're responsible for. Now, responsibility, I think, is sometimes the wrong word, but let's put it another way. The people they love. Perfect love, Alan said as he quoted 1 John 4. Perfect love drives out all fear. Love has its sanity. Love of others' need of us. For the love of them, they need us sober and well, and they need us alive. Because we're not only for ourselves. We're not made to be isolated islands. We're all called to serve, to love. So here's some good news. In Jesus Christ, there is grace to take up your responsibility to love and to serve others. And he promises that those who lose their lives for his sake and the gospel will suddenly find that they've got life again. Life.